Charles Whitmore stepped off the private jet with an air of superiority, his designer sunglasses reflecting the bright London sun. He was a man who had everything: money, influence, and a lifestyle most people could only dream of. But Charles wasn't in London for culture or history. He was there because his wife insisted on a family vacation. To him, it was just another chore, something to endure until he could return to his lavish penthouse. As they made their way through the city in a rented luxury car, Charles scrolled through his phone, barely glancing at the iconic landmarks they passed. Big Ben, seen it online. The Tower of London, too crowded. His teenage kids sat silently in the backseat, glued to their screens, while his wife tried to spark conversation about their itinerary. "Tomorrow, we're visiting Buckingham Palace," she said cheerfully. Charles groaned audibly. A bunch of guys standing around in funny hats. Sounds thrilling. The next morning, Charles's frustration reached a boiling point as he stood there, face to face with the unyielding guard. The crowd around him seemed oblivious to his growing agitation, too busy snapping photos or admiring the palace grounds. But Charles wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, people jumped at his command, catered to his whims, and treated him with the utmost respect, or at least acted like they did. Here, in front of this stoic figure, he felt powerless, insignificant, and it infuriated him. "Do you even hear me?" Charles barked, his voice louder now, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He stepped closer, invading the guard's personal space. "I'm talking to you." Still, Corporal Patel didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture unwavering. To an outsider, it might have seemed admirable, his discipline, his commitment to duty. But to Charles, it was infuriating. How dare this man, this guard, ignore someone like him? The tourists nearby began to take notice. A few snapped photos, thinking Charles was just another loudmouth tourist trying to get a reaction. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads disapprovingly. One elderly woman leaned over to her companion and muttered, "What's wrong with that man? Doesn't he know better?" But Charles couldn't hear any of it. All he could focus on was the guard's refusal to acknowledge him. In his pocket, Charles's fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, the can of spray paint he'd bought earlier that day from a souvenir shop. It had been an impulse purchase, one of those quirky items he thought would amuse his kids later. Now, as anger clouded his judgment, the can felt heavier, more significant. An idea sparked in his mind. An ugly, reckless idea. "You think you're better than me?" Charles sneered, pulling the can out and holding it up for everyone to see. "You don't move. You don't speak. You just stand there like some statue." His voice dripped with contempt, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't anger anymore. It was hatred. Hatred for the guard's silence, for his composure, for everything he represented. Without warning, Charles uncapped the can and shook it violently. The sharp rattle echoed through the air, drawing gasps from the crowd. "Let's see how perfect you look after this," he snarled, raising the can high above his head. Before anyone could stop him, he pressed down on the nozzle, releasing a stream of bright green paint onto the guard's immaculate red coat. The thick liquid splattered across the fabric, dripping down onto the polished black boots below. The crowd erupted into chaos. People screamed, children cried, and phones were whipped out to capture the scene unfolding before them. Some shouted at Charles, calling him names and demanding he stop, but he was beyond reason now. As the paint ran down the guard's chest, Charles leaned in close, his face twisted with venom. "Maybe now you'll pay attention," he spat, his words laced with malice. But what happened next shocked even Charles. From somewhere deep within himself, Corporal Patel found the strength to remain still, not out of fear, but out of sheer resolve. Though the paint stained his uniform and streaked down his skin, he did not blink, did not move. His dignity was intact, a silent testament to his training and character. For Charles, however, the damage was done. not just to the guard, but to himself. Little did he realize, this single act of cruelty would set off a firestorm that would consume his life entirely. As the green paint dripped down Corporal Patel's uniform, the crowd erupted into a mix of shock, outrage, and disbelief. Some people screamed, while others scrambled to record the scene on their phones. The bright colors of the paint contrasted sharply against the guard's red coat and black boots, making the act even more jarring. It wasn't just vandalism. It felt like an attack on something sacred, a desecration of tradition and respect. A young woman standing nearby couldn't contain her anger. "What is wrong with you?" she shouted at Charles, stepping forward with her phone pointed directly at him. Her voice trembled with emotion as she continued filming. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just some random guy in a costume. He's a soldier, a symbol of this country." Charles, still holding the spray can, turned to face her, his expression a mix of defiance and confusion. "Oh, come on," he scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "It's just paint. He's not going to melt." His casual tone only fueled the growing tension around him. More voices joined in, berating him for his actions. Another bystander, an older man with a thick British accent, stepped closer, pointing a finger at Charles. "You think your money makes you untouchable, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. There are consequences for behavior like this. People all over the world are watching right now." Sure enough, dozens of tourists were live streaming the incident on social media platforms. Within seconds, clips of the confrontation began spreading like wildfire online. The situation escalated quickly when security personnel rushed toward the scene. Uniformed officers pushed through the throng of people, their faces grim with determination. One officer barked orders for everyone to step back, creating space between Charles and the guard. Another approached Charles, demanding that he drop the spray can immediately. Reluctantly, Charles complied, tossing it onto the ground with a sneer. Meanwhile, Corporal Patel remained motionless, his face streaked with green paint but otherwise unreadable. To those who understood the gravity of the moment, his silence spoke volumes. Here was a man trained to endure hardship, to represent strength and discipline, even in the face of humiliation. And yet, the image of him standing there, covered in paint, struck a chord with everyone present. It was impossible not to feel sympathy for him, and disdain for the man responsible. Back in the crowd, someone shouted, "Call the police." Others echoed the demand, their voices rising in unison. Phones continued to flash as videos captured every detail: Charles's smug expression, the splattered paint, the horrified reactions of onlookers. By now, hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #ShameOnYou had begun trending on Twitter, drawing attention from news outlets across the globe. As the officers placed Charles under arrest, cuffing his hands behind his back, he finally seemed to realize the magnitude of what he'd done. Wait, he protested, his earlier bravado crumbling. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just joking around." But no one was laughing. Not the officers, not the crowd, and certainly not Corporal Patel, who stood silently as a testament to grace under pressure. By the time Charles was led away, the story had already gone viral. Screenshots of the video flooded Instagram and TikTok, accompanied by captions calling out his behavior. Comment sections filled with outrage, with many questioning how someone could show such blatant disrespect. For Charles, the nightmare was only beginning. What started as a petty act of frustration had spiraled into something far bigger than he could have imagined, a public spectacle that would haunt him for years to come. The moment Charles was shoved into the backseat of the police car, reality began to sink in. The flashing blue lights reflected off his face as he sat slumped, staring blankly at the floor. His designer clothes were smeared with flecks of green paint, a grim reminder of what had just happened. For the first time in years, Charles felt powerless, trapped in a situation where his wealth and influence couldn't save him. By the time they arrived at the station, the story was everywhere. News outlets around the world had picked up the viral footage. turning Charles into an overnight pariah. Headlines like "Wealthy Tourist Attacks Royal Guard" and "Entitled Man Destroys Tradition" dominated newspapers and websites. Social media users dissected every detail of the incident, from Charles's sarcastic remarks to the guard's stoic response. Memes mocking him spread rapidly, depicting him as a spoiled tourist throwing tantrums over trivial matters. One particularly popular meme showed Charles spraying paint on famous monuments like the Statue of Liberty and the Eiffel Tower, captioned, "When privilege meets stupidity." Back home, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Charles's business partners called emergency meetings, distancing themselves from him publicly. "This reflects poorly on our brand," one executive said bluntly during a video conference. Another chimed in, "Customers are canceling contracts because of this. We can't afford to be associated with someone who behaves this way." Within hours, key sponsors pulled out of deals worth millions, citing irreparable damage to their reputations. The stock prices of Charles's company plummeted, wiping out years of hard work in a single day. His personal life unraveled just as quickly. Friends stopped answering his calls, and acquaintances unfollowed him on social media. Even his closest confidants avoided him, fearing guilt by association. At home, his wife confronted him, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do something so reckless?" she demanded, clutching her phone tightly. "Our kids are being bullied at school because of you. Do you even realize what you've done?" Speaking of the kids, they weren't spared either. Classmates mocked them relentlessly, calling them names like "Paint Dad's Kids" and asking if they planned to vandalize the school next. Teachers reported that both children had withdrawn socially, refusing to participate in class or talk to anyone. Their once happy family dynamic shattered overnight, leaving everyone feeling isolated and ashamed. Meanwhile, Corporal James Patel became an unlikely hero. Media outlets praised his composure and professionalism, highlighting how he maintained his dignity despite the humiliation. Interviews with former colleagues revealed stories of his dedication and humility, painting him as a role model for others. People rallied behind him, organizing fundraisers and sending messages of support. A petition to award him special recognition gained thousands of signatures within days. As the days passed, Charles found himself utterly alone. No one defended him, not his lawyers, not his friends, not even his own family. Every news segment about the incident portrayed him as the villain, a symbol of unchecked privilege and entitlement. Protesters gathered outside his mansion, holding signs that read "Respect our guards" and "Privilege has consequences." Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, wondering how such a wealthy man could act so recklessly. For Charles, the weight of his actions pressed down heavily. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just paint, just a joke, but deep down, he knew better. What started as a moment of frustration had spiraled into something unimaginable, destroying everything he held dear. And yet, the worst was still to come. As the legal process loomed ahead, Charles realized that the consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. There was no escaping the storm he had created, and no one left to help him weather it. The courtroom was packed on the day of Charles's trial, a sea of reporters, curious onlookers, and angry citizens filling every available seat. Cameras flashed like strobe lights as he shuffled in, his head bowed low to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. Gone was the confident swagger he once wore. Instead, he looked frail, almost unrecognizable. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, a sign of the weight he'd lost during the weeks leading up to the trial. Stress had carved deep lines into his face, making him appear years older than he actually was. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They presented video evidence from multiple angles, showing Charles taunting Corporal Patel before dousing him with paint. Witnesses took the stand, recounting how shocked and appalled they were by his behavior. One woman described how she'd feared for the guard's safety, while another spoke about the collective gasp that rippled through the crowd when the paint hit. Social media posts were also submitted as evidence, highlighting the global outrage sparked by the incident. The phrase "unchecked privilege" came up repeatedly, painting Charles not just as an individual offender, but as a symbol of broader societal issues. Charles's defense team tried their best to mitigate the damage. They argued that it had been a momentary lapse in judgment, a foolish act born out of frustration rather than malice. They emphasized his contributions to charity over the years and promised that he was truly sorry for what he'd done. But none of it seemed to resonate with the judge or the jury. Every apology rang hollow against the backdrop of the viral videos and the widespread condemnation they had inspired. When Corporal Patel took the stand, the room fell silent. Dressed in his crisp uniform, now freshly cleaned and pressed, he exuded quiet dignity. His voice was calm and measured as he recounted the events of that day. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize. Instead, he simply stated the facts, explaining how he had followed protocol despite the provocation. When asked how he felt about the incident, he paused briefly before responding. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I knew my duty was to remain composed. I represent something bigger than myself, a tradition, a legacy, and the values this country stands for." The crowd erupted in applause after his testimony, forcing the judge to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Charles sat motionless, staring at the floor, unable to meet Corporal Patel's eyes. For the first time, he truly understood the gravity of what he'd done, not just to one man, but to an institution, a culture, and countless people who looked up to it. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came down, guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced Charles to 2 years in prison without parole, along with hefty fines and mandatory community service upon release. She emphasized that his actions had undermined public trust and disrespected national pride, warranting severe consequences. As the bailiffs led him away, Charles glanced back at his wife and children, who sat silently in the front row. Their faces were blank, devoid of emotion, and it cut deeper than any punishment ever could. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Protesters cheered, holding signs that read "Justice served" and "No respect, no freedom." Reporters shouted questions at Charles's lawyers, but they refused to comment, rushing past the cameras with their heads down. Meanwhile, supporters of Corporal Patel celebrated the outcome, praising him for his resilience and grace under pressure. Someone handed him flowers, which he accepted with a small smile, thanking them quietly before disappearing into the crowd. For Charles, the walk to the prison van felt endless. Each step weighed heavier than the last, not because of the physical distance, but because of the knowledge that his life would never be the same again. The world had turned its back on him, and there was no going back. As the doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside, he realized that the hardest part was yet to come. The road to redemption, if such a thing was even possible, would be long, lonely, and fraught with challenges. And for the first time in his life, Charles had no one else to blame but himself. Prison life hit Charles like a freight train. The sterile, cold walls of his cell felt suffocating, and the constant hum of chatter and clanging metal doors grated on his nerves. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by luxury, plush carpets, private jets, and 5-star meals, the harsh reality of incarceration was unbearable. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort that wore him down. It was the loss of identity, the stripping away of everything that had once defined him. From day one, Charles became a target. Word spread quickly among the inmates about who he was and what he'd done. "Oh, you're the guy who messed with the Royal Guard," one inmate sneered during mealtime, leaning across the table with a smirk. "That's rich. Real classy move." Others chimed in, laughing mockingly as they mimicked pouring paint onto an invisible guard. Charles tried to ignore them, keeping his head down and focusing on his food, but the jeers followed him everywhere. In the yard, in the showers, even in the tiny library where he sought refuge. But it wasn't just the verbal abuse that made prison unbearable. Charles struggled to adapt to the rigid routines and lack of privacy. Waking up at dawn for roll call, eating bland food served in chip trays, and enduring endless hours of manual labor broke him mentally and physically. He had never lifted anything heavier than his wallet before, yet now he was forced to scrub floors, stack crates, and clean toilets alongside men who seemed to relish watching him squirm. His hands blistered, his back ached, and his pride shattered bit by bit. What hurt most, though, were the letters. At first, Charles clung to hope that someone, anyone, would reach out to him. Maybe his wife would write, telling him she still loved him despite everything. Or perhaps an old friend would send words of encouragement, reminding him that this nightmare would eventually end. But instead, the letters he received only deepened his despair. Former colleagues detailed how his actions had tanked their business deals and alienated clients. One letter from a major investor read, "Your selfishness cost us millions. Don't expect forgiveness." Even worse were the messages from strangers. People sent hate mail addressed to the Paint Man, calling him names and accusing him of being a disgrace to humanity. Some included newspaper clippings of Corporal Patel receiving awards for his composure under pressure, rubbing salt into Charles's wounds. Each envelope he opened felt like another nail in his coffin, sealing off any chance of redemption. Visitation days were equally painful. His wife came once, her face pale and drawn as she sat across from him behind thick glass. She didn't cry or yell. She simply stared at him, shaking her head slowly. "I can't do this anymore," she finally said, her voice trembling. "The kids, they need stability. They don't deserve this kind of life." Before he could respond, she stood up and walked away, leaving Charles staring blankly at the empty chair. His children never visited. Letters from the school counselor revealed they were struggling to cope, often skipping classes and lashing out at teachers. "They feel abandoned," one note read. "And honestly, Mr. Whitmore, they have every right to." Those words haunted Charles, replaying in his mind during sleepless nights when guilt gnawed at him like a relentless beast. As weeks turned into months, Charles began writing apologies, dozens of them, to Corporal Patel, to his family, to the public. He poured his heart into each letter, begging for forgiveness and promising to change. But no replies ever came. It was as if the world had collectively decided to erase him, leaving him trapped in a void of loneliness and regret. By the time his sentence neared its end, Charles was a shadow of the man he used to be. His once imposing frame was gaunt, his eyes hollow. Prison hadn't just punished him, it had stripped him bare, exposing the ugliness beneath his polished exterior. And while he knew freedom awaited him outside those walls, he also understood that true liberty might forever remain out of reach. The day Charles walked out of prison, the world felt foreign and unwelcoming. The heavy steel gates creaked shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his chest. He stood there for a moment, blinking against the sunlight he hadn't seen in years without bars blocking it. Freedom should have felt sweet, but instead it tasted bitter. His clothes hung loosely on his frail frame, and his worn-out sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he took hesitant steps forward. There was no one waiting for him, no family, no friends, no chauffeur holding a sign with his name, just an empty street stretching ahead, indifferent to his existence. Charles tried to rebuild his life, but every attempt ended in failure. His old business contacts ignored his calls or sent polite rejections, citing brand alignment issues. When he applied for jobs under fake names, employers recognized him during background checks and turned him away. Even menial work eluded him. Coffee shops refused to hire him after customers complained about seeing that guy behind the counter. Homeless shelters became his only refuge, though even there, whispers followed him. "Isn't that the paint guy?" someone muttered once, loud enough for everyone to hear. Charles kept his head down, pretending not to notice. His financial ruin was complete. With no income and mounting debts from legal fees, the mansion he once called home had been sold off, its contents auctioned to cover expenses. His luxury car collection, his designer wardrobe, all gone. Now, he wandered the streets with nothing but a tattered backpack containing a few changes of clothes and a notebook filled with unanswered letters he'd written in prison. Each night, he slept on park benches or in abandoned buildings, shivering under thin blankets as cold winds bit through his threadbare jacket. But the worst part wasn't the physical hardships. It was the isolation. Everywhere he went, people stared at him, their eyes filled with contempt. Parents pulled their children away when they saw him approaching, muttering warnings about bad influences. Strangers hurled insults, calling him names like Paint Man or Royal Wrecker. Social media hadn't forgotten him either. Whenever someone recognized him, photos of his disheveled appearance popped up online within minutes, accompanied by mocking captions. One viral post showed him rummaging through a trash bin for food, captioned, "Karma's serving dinner tonight." In rare moments of clarity, Charles reflected on how far he'd fallen. He thought about the choices that led him here, the arrogance, the entitlement, the reckless act of pouring paint on a man who had done nothing to deserve it. Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, keeping him awake at night. He replayed the incident over and over in his mind, imagining alternate endings where he walked away instead of escalating things. But no amount of regret could undo what he'd done. The damage was permanent, both to others and to himself. One evening, as he sat on a bench in a deserted park, Charles noticed a newspaper someone had left behind. Flipping through its pages, he froze when he came across a feature article about Corporal James Patel. The photo showed Patel standing tall in his uniform, receiving an award for exemplary service. The accompanying story highlighted his resilience and dedication, celebrating him as a symbol of national pride. Charles stared at the picture for a long time, his chest tightening with shame. Here was a man who had faced humiliation with dignity, while Charles crumbled under the weight of his own actions. As tears blurred his vision, Charles realized something painful. Redemption wasn't coming. No matter how sorry he was, no matter how hard he tried to make amends, the world had moved on without him. Corporal Patel continued to inspire others, living a life of purpose and respect, while Charles remained trapped in the wreckage of his past. For the first time, he understood the true cost of his privilege and the price of throwing it all away in a single, selfish moment. Months turned into years, and Charles became a ghost of his former self, wandering the streets with no direction or purpose. His once imposing presence was now reduced to a frail figure, hunched over and unnoticed by the world around him. The vibrant city that had once catered to his every whim now seemed indifferent to his struggles. He spent his days scavenging for scraps of food, dodging judgmental glances, and avoiding the occasional shouts from people who recognized him. "Hey, isn't that the guy?" they'd say, pointing and laughing as he shuffled away. One cold winter morning, Charles found himself sitting on a bench near Buckingham Palace, the very place where it all began. It was early, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional tourist snapping photos of the iconic building. The sight of the palace stirred something deep within him, a mix of regret, shame, and longing for a life he could never reclaim. He pulled out his worn notebook, flipping through pages filled with letters he'd written but never sent. Each one was an apology, a plea for forgiveness, a promise to be better. None of them had ever reached their intended recipients. As he sat there lost in thought, a familiar face appeared in the distance. Corporal James Patel, still wearing his red coat and towering bearskin hat, marched past the gates with the same composure and dignity that had captivated the world years ago. Charles froze, watching him from afar. For a moment, he considered approaching Patel, perhaps finally saying what he'd been too cowardly to say before. But as he took a hesitant step forward, he stopped himself. What would he even say? "I'm sorry" felt hollow after everything that had happened. Besides, Patel deserved peace, not the burden of hearing from the man who had wronged him so deeply. Instead, Charles retreated to the shadows, watching silently as Patel stood guard. Tourists gathered around, taking pictures and marveling at the tradition and discipline embodied by the royal guards. Someone nearby commented, "They're like living history," and Charles couldn't help but nod in agreement. In that moment, he realized how much he had taken for granted, how blind his arrogance had made him. These men weren't just symbols. They represented values he had mocked and disrespected: honor, duty, and resilience. That night, Charles returned to his usual spot under a bridge, wrapping himself in a thin blanket to ward off the biting cold. As he lay there staring at the stars, he thought about the stark contrast between his life and Patel's. While Charles had spiraled into ruin, Patel had risen above adversity, earning respect and admiration from millions. The unfairness of it all gnawed at him, not because he envied Patel's success, but because he understood how deserving Patel was of it, and how undeserving Charles was of anything good. In the months that followed, Charles disappeared completely from public view. Rumors circulated about his whereabouts, but no one knew for sure where he had gone. Some speculated he had left the country, while others believed he had succumbed to the harsh realities of homelessness. Either way, the world moved on, forgetting about the man who had once sparked international outrage. Meanwhile, Corporal Patel continued to serve with distinction, inspiring countless people with his story. He often spoke at schools and community events, using his platform to advocate for kindness, respect, and understanding. When asked about Charles during interviews, Patel simply said, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether we choose to learn from them." And yet, somewhere in the forgotten corners of the city, Charles lived out his final days alone, haunted by the choices that had cost him everything. His story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that actions have consequences and privilege comes with responsibility. While one man's legacy grew stronger with time, the other faded into obscurity, leaving behind nothing but a bitter lesson etched into the annals of history.